Good day, everyone. So the video for today will be regarding a little bit of more of a deep dive into setting up Central Ledger with TigerBeetle and running tests on that configuration using everything from the Central Ledger repository with the additional testing tooling. Okay, so the very first step here is, or the very first phase here is that we need to configure the setup first before we can run it. So the file we're looking at right now is the plan configuration file. This allows us to generate the number of accounts to be created, random accounts, the number of account lookups to be performed during the test, or rather the number of random account lookups, the number of transfers to be created, the number of rejections on those transfers, the number of transfer lookups to perform, and then whether we want to perform a commit on a prepare, or rather a fulfill on a prepare immediately after doing a prepare. So that basically eliminates the two-step process in terms of the HTTP requests. So it will be a single HTTP request, and it will perform both a prepare and fulfill. And then the second last item here is the transaction amount, the maximum transaction amount. So transaction amounts lower than $200 will be generated. And then, as you probably noticed, the last value is the actual currency to be used. So there's a little utility that is called the test data util. You can run that utility by simply running the stress test utility main class and telling it that you want to generate test data and pointing it to this configuration file. As you can see, we've got the CL plan config file, and then it requires an output directory. So the output directory is what is basically going to be our random data. So let's generate or run this command. So we're just going to run it from the IDE here. Okay, success. So now if we go and open our data, our randomly generated data, we could see here that it generated a create participant with a unique name and the currency as USD, and it will have all of the relevant information. So you can see the action type is very important, as the action type would delegate what will be the inner body of the JSON that will be posted. And then you can see here further down, we've got a transfer prepare that would be executed against those created accounts, and you can see in between here a transfer lookup. So there's no need to have request or response body for a transfer lookup, because the utility while running will cache valid transfers and then perform lookups on those transfers. It is important to note the sequencing here though, because this input data file will be the file that will be posted via JMeter into Central Ledger as part of the test run. So this static file enables us to run JMeter on different environments and having the same source of data. Okay, so now that we've got our input data, we can go more into Central Ledger core configuration. So there's a brand new section being introduced with the Central Ledger TigerBeetle release, and that would be the tweaking ability for configuring TigerBeetle specific functionality. Like the first obvious one here is to enable TigerBeetle or not. And you can obviously run TigerBeetle with Central Ledger enabled, or you can have it disabled, which is your traditional way of running it. You can disable some of the functions, or you can disable the DBMS, which will mean that your transfers won't be stored in the DBMS, but in TigerBeetle only. So for today, we'll just run not using any batching, which TigerBeetle supports. We'll just be running in standard mode with TigerBeetle enabled and using the DBMS. So in this configuration, we'll be running Central Ledger with its full DBMS capabilities as well as TigerBeetle. And then we'll just need to define which part of which cluster this TigerBeetle client needs to point to, and all of the replica endpoints for TigerBeetle. Okay, so now that we've got our basic configuration going, we can step into the README of Central Ledger to fire up our containers. Okay, so very first step here is we're firing up our Central Ledger instance, and then next we are SHing into this instance. We can see here that TigerBeetle is already running on this. This is the Node.js instance, so this instance already got a running TigerBeetle. We can just reuse that instance as we generated brand new test data when we ran the gen test data command. So there's no reason not to just use what's there. But if you haven't set up TigerBeetle yet, you would first need to initiate TigerBeetle and telling it the directories where it needs to create data storage files. Okay, so now I'm going to start TigerBeetle. So there we go, the first instance, the second instance, and the third. You'll notice that all of them are in the same cluster. So I'm just going to do so we can see here we've got our 3 running instances over here. And lastly, we will need to fire up the Central Ledger API in order to perform the test. So that's going to be a simple yarn start. And there we can see the endpoints exposed for our testing today. Okay, so now that we've got our test environment up and running, we can start the second phase of performing these tests, and that is actually to fire up JMeter along with pointing to the right configuration file. So there's already scripts prepared to go and start JMeter. You've got 2 modes that you can run JMeter in. The first being with the GUI, the user interface, where you would do a lot of tweaking before actually, or to get your ideal run configuration, you'll use a lot of the user interface to configure a lot of the parameters. And then once you're happy with your parameters, it's then good to run in console mode, which just means you just have to add the console flag as a parameter, and that will run JMeter in console mode and generate an HTML output report for all of the test metrics and test data. That's obviously recommended when you're running really high volumes, and yeah, where the user interface updates would just cause too much of a memory overhead. Okay, so for today, we'll just run it in the standard user interface mode. So the script will do a complete build of the JMeter tooling, and then eventually it will fire up the JMeter user interface. So you'll notice that I'm just going to switch back to the actual folder, the project folder. There is a configuration file required for JMeter that is basically your complete test plan and configuration. So the out of the box one that we see here today has got some standard configurations, but nothing stops you from going and adding additional plugins or your own metrics. This is just the default one. So you have the ability to add much more metrics and add much more configuration. Okay, so the very first thing we need to do is to configure the actual plugin, or rather the test runner that was developed specifically for Central Ledger. And this is what the stress test mapping sampler is doing. As part of the startup, the Java archive gets created and referenced in the JMeter class path in order to point to the right class that would be responsible for performing these tests. And again, this file may be manipulated to tweak performance or to change behavior in how tests should be performed. But this essentially allows us a lot of flexibility with regards to testing Central Ledger and the data and where we're capturing the test data. Okay, and then the bottom part over here is where we point to the in-data file. I'm going to switch back to the IDE, and that you can see is the static data file. You can generate multiples of these and perform various tests, but the one that we see over here is the one that we're going to use today. And yeah, if we run this command again, it will generate a new set of random data, as you can see here. So when performing these tests, you can save one of these files if you want to reuse it in other environments. But for today, yeah, we will just use the one that we generated now, which is the input file for your test data. And the second parameter over here is the endpoint, and that's the central ledger endpoint. You can obviously run this from a different location and run it against a server with no other software running on it to get the ideal test configuration. Today, we're just testing everything on a single box, which is definitely not meant for production execution. And we will just go configure our threads over here. So today we'll just run a cycle of 1,000 transactions, and in this sense the transaction would be a request rather. So we'll run 1,000 requests against central ledger, and that'll be a mixture of transfer and account lookups and our configuration basically from our original file. We'll just run a single thread, as we're not interested in running super high volumes today. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the summary report. We are basically ready to run our tests, and I'm going to go ahead and hit the start button. You can see here is basically all of these transfers being created, the accounts being created firstly, and then followed by all the transfer prepares and lookups. And what this view results tree view allows us to do is to see any errors in just a quick view and see every request in a lot of detail. So in this example, if I click on one of our prepares, I'm able to look at exactly the request data as well as the request header data. So this request body was the raw JSON request that was sent to central ledger, which is to perform a transfer prepared. And we stored additional data like the index in the JSON in data file, so that we always know where exactly in the in data this came from, along with the URL and then the type of action, which is also shown in the actual URL or the label. And then everything like the response data is also being captured. You will notice that if we go to the summary report, it captures the bytes being sent over the wire. There's a breakdown of, we can see over here that all of these accounts were newly created. There were no non-existing accounts. So those, if I were to run the exact same data set with the same accounts, you'll see the second time around it will indicate that these are now existing accounts. So an account would be looked up rather than be created, and it will reflect in the test case. So you can even run tests to compare those type of stats. And then we can, each one of these plugins allows us to have different views of the data that we tested. A very interesting one here to look at is the response times graph, which will indicate to us, we can see that performance dramatically increased, and this was most likely due to the participants being cached in Redis and soon after being created, and then immediately the transfer prepares shot down significantly from 56 milliseconds down to 20. And if we look at our aggregate graph, we can see here that there was no errors. The throughput, obviously we did a very low volume, very low test. We can see that we're running at, for our prepares, at about 25 TPS. Now, with ideal configurations, you'll want to spawn a lot more threads and hit the system a lot harder, but for today's test, we'll just keep it at that. And this allows you then to configure and reconfigure your test configuration until you get the ideal results. Okay, and a very important statistic to note over here is the standard deviation. You want to make sure that you run the test where your deviation isn't affected heavily. You want to keep your standard deviation as low as possible. So for our run today, we could see that our deviation there we go, was running quite high. The account creations is quite a fairly high standard deviation, although not terribly high. but then at least for our transfer prepares and for transfer lookups, the deviations were very low, which is great. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to quit JMeter. So we could, that's our summary for running the JMeter in the user interface mode. The next test, I'm going to run the same test, but this time I'm going to run it in console mode. So the console mode will generate, we'll run the same, we're just going to use the same in data file. So because I didn't change any of the properties, it's going to use the properties as I last saved it when I just ran it now. So it's going to use our same data input file. One thing to keep in mind is when it does these prepares and fulfills, the transaction ID is generated uniquely every time. So even though your payer and payee will be the same along with the amounts, as well as the other data, your transaction ID will be uniquely generated. And here we can see we've got no user interface. It was loaded. It simply ran the whole test from the console, and it keeps giving you a little summary of what your average TPS is. We can already see by just running this tool in console mode, our TPS rate is significantly higher. And then at the end of our run, we will have an output file. There we go. We will have this JMeter out, and this file is basically the full report of the test. So it's going to not contain a lot of data, as we only performed 1,000 transactions. But nonetheless, you can see what the transaction per second throughput is. And you can see for the actual lookups, and we can see now that all of these participants were existing accounts. So now basically it performed lookups, and we can see that the TPS rates are significantly lower because there's no need to go and create those accounts and then look those accounts up and then put them in Redis. It was simply a case of doing the account lookups from Redis and then performing those transfers. So already an improvement there. And you can see then here over the response times, it's quite static, and we don't have the 52 millisecond startup for those participants where lookups had to be performed immediately from those existing participants. The response times are kept very low. And then at the end of running the tests. Okay, if there's any questions, please put a shout out to the Mojaloop channels. Thank you very much for watching the video today.